I want to bring in Michael McFaul, former U.S. ambassador to Russia and an MSNBC international affairs analyst. So much to unpack, but let me start where Megyn left off, which is the president suggesting that the security backstop on the part of the United States will be that there will be Americans working in Ukraine as part of this rare earth mineral deal. Is that security?
No, it's not security. And there's a chicken and egg problem here. What company is going to invest for billions and billions of dollars for a multi-year, decades-long investment, right? We're talking about mining, right? It takes a long time to do that. What company is going to do that if they don't think their property rights are secured, if they don't think their people are safe? So it's better. I appreciate the logic, but the devil's in the details. And unless there's real security, real peace, enduring peace, no American company is going to send their employees to be targets for Russian aggression.
Well, the president seemed to think that all of this talk about the need for security may have been overstated. Here's exactly what he said. He said, I just don't think you're going to have a problem with security. Security is not going to be a problem. Let me play a little bit more of what the president had to say about whether or not Vladimir Putin could be trusted if there was a deal made.
Mr. President, what would you be willing to do if Vladimir Putin did not stick to the terms of any deal on Ukraine?
If he not what?
He did not stick to the terms of any deal on Ukraine, because he has a history of not sticking to his word when it comes to international agreements.
I think he'll keep his word. I think I've spoken to him. I've known him for a long time now. You know, I've known him. We had to go through the Russian hoax together. That was not a good thing. It's not fair. That was a rigged deal and had nothing to do with Russia. It was a rigged deal with inside the country, and they had to put up with that too. They put up with a lot. It wasn't just us. They had to put up with it, with a phony story that was made up. I've known him for a long time now, and I think he will. I don't believe he's going to violate his word. I don't think he'll be back. When we make a deal, I think the deal is going to hold.
I think the deal is going to hold. He says he's known Vladimir Putin for a long time. You have as well, Mr. Ambassador. Do you have 100% confidence that if a deal is made, Vladimir Putin will stick to it?
No. Why? Based on what? President Trump was in office for 4 years. What deal did he ever conclude with Vladimir Putin? And by the way, let's remember the war in Ukraine started in 2014, not 2022. It was ongoing in eastern Ukraine for the entire Trump presidency. They achieved no peace agreement then. But number two, from the Ukrainian perspective, they don't trust the word of Putin, and they don't trust our words either. We signed a deal with the Ukrainians in 1994 where they gave up their nuclear weapons in return for security guarantees from us that didn't play out. So they want a little more meat on the bones. Just trusting Putin is not something that they're going to go along with. And by the way, the president of the United States should not either. We want to have a lasting deal that is credible, that commits him to peace, not just his word that I'm going to do this because I'm friends with, Donald Trump.
You know, it's been fascinating to watch, I think, first with Emmanuel Macron and now with Keir Starmer, to see how they're trying to walk the line, right? They obviously want to support Ukraine. They also know that there is a way to approach Donald Trump. But both of them felt it was necessary, with all the press there assembled, to correct President Trump when he suggested that somehow every single penny that the Europeans have given to Ukraine has been a loan. And you heard him say quite a bit of it was gifted, essentially the same thing that Emmanuel Macron has talked about. You and I have spoken so much over the years, Mr. Ambassador, about how to approach Vladimir Putin. But what about approaching Donald Trump at a critical moment like this for Ukraine and the security of Europe?
So I am glad these European leaders are coming to meet with the president. That is helpful. I also want to applaud President Trump for getting engaged in trying to end this barbaric, horrific invasion of Ukraine that Putin started, by the way. But the fact that he is talking about it, that's a good sign, too. Number three, I actually think it's a very good sign that he is going to meet with President Zelensky tomorrow. This mineral deal, you know, I'm embarrassed by it. We shouldn't be in colonial exploitation of countries that are weak. But actually, the Ukrainians negotiated hard. It's not a bad deal for Ukraine. And most importantly, Zelensky said, I want to come meet with the president to talk to him, because in doing that, you see the president's position moving. One of the things he just said right now that needs to be underscored, he said, we're going to try to get back some of their territory. That was news. He's never said that before. He was
as much of the land as we can get back is the exact quote.
Exactly. That is new. And that happens when the president is confronted with leaders sitting there. That is a very good sign. So I appreciate you have to deal with who's the president of the United States. I didn't get to choose who was in the Kremlin. When I was the ambassador, you interact with the leadership that is at hand. And I think these are positive developments, maybe getting to a better place on the negotiations than we were just a few days ago.
It was also interesting toward the end of that, I think it was at least half an hour, he was asked about his statements about Volodymyr Zelensky being a dictator. And he said, did I say that? I can't believe I said that. Next question. Let's remind folks of what President Trump did say just on February 19th.
Think of it, a modestly successful comedian, a dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast or he's not going to have a country left.
So for a lot of folks, Zelensky tomorrow, and I want to ask you specifically about that, but I was thinking about some sort of parallel when he was asked about whether or not the United States would be there for the UK if they came under threat. And you heard Starmer say, we've always been there for each other, right? But how does Zelensky approach this tomorrow, knowing what you know about him and the way that over the course of 3 years, he has kept a lot of the world's attention on what's happening in his country?
Well, first, before I get to that excellent question, I just want to underscore something you just showed, that it's easy on social media and it's easy when you're talking to your base to say crazy things. It's a lot harder when you're sitting next to the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And the fact that he would not acknowledge what he said, that's progress. And that's why this interacting with the president and the way that they're doing is progress. Because, of course, Zelensky is not a dictator. He's a democratically elected president of Ukraine. They have a law for martial law. And Putin has been in power for 25 years. So that's progress. And I think Zelensky has to continue to use a similar strategy. He needs to praise the president for this mineral deal, which is pretty, you're going to see it. It's pretty thin, shall we say, on the details, and that's what the Ukrainians want. But they want to keep President Trump engaged in the peace process and not just becoming the advocate for President Putin. That is their greatest fear, that he just regurgitates Putin's talking points like he did about Zelensky being the dictator. And the best way to keep him off of that is direct personal engagement with the President of the United States.